Hello, and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. I'm Joe Devine, and today I'm joined by Seb Stafford-Bloor.
Hi, Joe.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very well.
Good. We were joined today by Ed Aarons, who is an exciting young journalist, the age of 39. That's not a good way to start, is it? It doesn't even mean anything. He recently wrote the book Made in Africa, The History of African Players in English Football. And whilst I've only read the first half of the first chapter, I already know it's brilliant because Seb's read the whole thing and told me it is.
Yeah, it is. It's absolutely fascinating. I mean, we won't cover the ground that we've gone over in the chat. We're so interesting. It's
Tell me about Ed's credentials.
Well, actually, I'll tell you a personal Ed story. I covered my first tournament with Ed Aarons. So
this sounds like a personal Seb story. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't like it.
You know how vain I am, and you know how I like to kind of twist things to make them really about me. But he's one of the senior journalists out in Poland when I did the under 21 final, under 21 Euros, and he sort of helped me with things like mix zones and print deadlines and stuff. So he's a good man, Ed Aarons. But he's written an excellent book. I like to think of myself as a fairly well-educated person on football matters, but I learned so much. And it was really interesting to chat to him about and find out some extra detail and, just to hear some of his perspectives on the more general issues which afflict African players and development from, in African football and longevity and the way players are remembered. It's a great chat. I really enjoyed it.
The book comes out on the 1st of June, I believe, and I'm sure you can buy it from all reputable sources if they aren't closed as a result of lockdown. But you can buy them online, yeah? Go to the websites where they sell them. I'm sure it's on Amazon. I bet it's on the publisher's website, published by Arena Sport. And also you'll see it on Ed Aarons' Twitter account. But basically we would encourage you to buy it and read it, not only because you will undoubtedly enjoy it and learn lots of stuff, but also because it's great to support work like this, isn't it, Seb? I mean, it's important work.
Yeah, and also, having actually read the book, I feel like my testimony's worth a little more than yours.
Yeah, go on.
No, definitely read it. It's it's called Made in Africa, out June the 1st, and you'll learn a lot about, I think, the players, obviously, and all the different chapters are based around a different story. But you also learn a lot about England during those periods of time, and through the way that some of these guys were treated, and it may not be the easiest read, but it's an important one and a really, really compelling one. So yeah, we don't really have a recommendation metric at Tifo. We don't have like 5 Tifos or 3 Philippes or whatever. So we'll just say go and read it. That's probably the best way of putting it.
we used to.
We should do. Like a couple, it gets 10 Craigs or 1 Alex.
It used to be. I remember before we started making videos like the form we do now, we used to make sort of silly review videos. And I remember giving one film about football 3.5 lion wombs. Yeah.
That didn't catch on then.
No, and it doesn't matter now. Anyway, head to your local Amazon and buy this book by Ed Aarons, Made in Africa, The History of African Players in English Football. Incidentally, if you're in the buying mood, you should buy a subscription to The Athletic. Look at me flog. That's very theathletic.com/Tifo. It's now the best way to support Tifo. If you appreciate what we do and you like us and you enjoy listening and watching to us, that doesn't make sense. Do please go and get yourself a free trial at The Athletic, because it appears as a little number for me, and for internal machinations it gives me power. So please do that. Also, the content is exceptionally good, and that's the main reason that you should do it. That's what I'm supposed to mention in the advert. But you'll get a free trial, so just do it. Okay, thanks for downloading today's episode, and thanks to Seb for asking all the questions. I'm not really in it, to be honest, not until the end. And of course, mainly, I should say, thank you to Ed Aarons for attending. And now it's in his hands that we leave you.
Ed, thanks for coming on the podcast. I really love the book. I mean, I'd be lying if I said that there were bits that I didn't find really quite harrowing. But I learned an awful lot from it. Not just about the players and the stories that you tell, but also the attitudes that they experienced. I felt like I learned an awful lot about my own country during the different decades, which I didn't really appreciate before. So it's not an easy read, but it's a brilliant, really well told story in many different parts. Can you just take us back to the beginning though? Where did your interest in African football come from?
Well, thank you very much for that. It's really kind of you to say so, first of all. But so it's really from the very start of liking football. I'm 39, so just turned 39, and it was really when I was sort of 9 or 10 years old that we started having the first African players coming into the Premier League after, obviously, the England v Cameroon quarter-final at the 1990 World Cup. And that's possibly one of my favourite games, certainly a game I'll always remember. And that really, I think, was the trigger for me to have an interest in African football, but I was very young at that age. But then over the years, players like, Peter Unlove and Tony Yeboah and Lucas Radebe sort of really captured my interest as growing up. And I think there's a lot of people in my sort of generation who hopefully will feel the same, that, these players who we hadn't heard of or seen people like them before in our game suddenly had come over and made a real impact in quite a short time. So that was really where it began for me. But, and I've continued that into my professional career as a journalist. And I lived in South Africa for a couple of years before and during and after the 2010 World Cup. Got to know a lot of people over there and a lot of people in African football, and just still absolutely love it. I say in the book, I was there for the Ghana v Uruguay famous quarter-final. So, many years on from, 30 years on from my childhood, and the Cameroon quarter-final, I was actually there in person for the famous Luis Suarez handball and everything. And I say in the book, actually, that, and it's true, that I really felt that. I really felt so upset, as much as any England defeat, and I'm a massive England fan as well. But, when Ghana went out, the whole of the continent, almost the whole of the world perhaps, was in their corner. And I really took that hard, and I realised, how much I love African football, really. And then, so since that point, really, I was looking to do something like this, because it's just looking around the landscape, really. There's nothing to record some of the impact that these players have had, especially, some of the stories that they've had to overcome, and, disadvantages and racism and all sorts of things. And there was nothing out there to chronicle it, really. And I thought, well, no one else is going to do it, then I'm going to do it, because I know a lot about African football. And I may not be African myself, but I think it's something that is, very important to have in our game, the history of our game.
Did you find when you took your first steps to cover African football, so presume this deals specifically with kind of 2010 and your move to South Africa, did you find, I'll lay this out from a personal perspective, African football fascinates me, but it also intimidates me a little bit in terms of the idea of, I've got a really sort of closed off Western attitude, which is presumably typical of Europeans, in that kind of, if I was to cover an African Cup of Nations, I wouldn't know where to start in terms of planning my reporting trip. Do you remember, I first met you in Poland when we were out there in 2017, I think. And it's easy, isn't it? You catch the flight here and you book your accommodation there. And I've spoken to a lot of people that feel the same way, in that you it's almost a little bit of a barrier to entry, in that you feel, I don't know, intimidating is probably the best way to describe it. Is that something you had to overcome, or did you just not feel that at all?
No, I know exactly what you mean. And certainly when I worked in South Africa, it was I enjoyed the experience of being in the minority. If you grow up in London and as a white person, say, you're in the majority, you don't really know what it's like to be one of the 3 or 4 black kids in the class or something like that. You know what I mean? But precisely in South Africa, yeah. I'd go to matches, and in the stadium there'd be me, maybe a couple of players, a couple of reporters, and pretty much everybody else would be black. And that was quite an eye-opening experience for me, just to experience the other side of, being in a minority. in some respect. And also, yeah, it is more of a step into the unknown as well with a lot of these places that you have to go to. But I really enjoy that, and especially, you know, I went to the African Nations Cup in Egypt in the last summer, and it was such a great experience just to see all the passion for the game there. Although, you know, it's very difficult to get in the ground and stuff. It's sort of, we had to get there like 3.5 hours at least before kickoff, and the security guards wouldn't let you in even if you had a press pass and things like that. But I think that the key is in those sort of situations, like anywhere really, is just to stay calm and enjoy the experience. And in fact, most people who see you there are not grateful, that's the wrong word, but, you know, really pleased that you've made the effort to, you know, get out of your comfort zone.
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember seeing a tweet from, I think it was Nick Ames, brilliant journalist, obviously, that we all know. But I remember him saying, I think he was out there too for Egypt, and he said, you know, this would be such a fantastic opportunity for a young journalist. And he was absolutely right. I just remember thinking, I can understand why people don't do that, and I can also understand why people appreciate it when sort of English journalists or European journalists do make the effort to leave that comfort zone, because it's kind of, I suppose it's really easy not to appreciate how easy we all have it here in terms of Premier League access. You turn up, there's your food, there's your press pass, hello, there's a security guard that you already know. It's just really interesting. It's something actually I'd love to do.
But actually, I'd just like to say quickly, you know, you get a lot more if you get to know people. You get much more coverage and the opportunity. The opportunity to speak to players. Like when I lived in South Africa, we used to call up players all the time, and there was a bit of, you know, press media barrier, but really things are a lot closer there. And I mean, I think they're trying to make it a bit more European in style, but I think that would take away some of the heart and soul of it if that happens, to be honest.
So do you mean there's a world where there isn't a press officer recording two different versions when you're doing an interview? I can't imagine that.
Well, no, a world where you can actually call up, you can actually call them up on their phone and get quotes. Just, you know,
we should do a podcast about that.
Yeah. Unbelievable.
Yeah. Let's dive into the book. Let's start with a player that most of us know. Most of the people you even haven't read the book will be aware of, hopefully. Albert Johanneson. There's a sentence in your book which really took me back, which really startled me a little bit. So, Phil Masinga and Lucas Radibi have just arrived at Leeds United. And obviously, Albert Johanneson, first black player to play an FA Cup final in 1965. I'd always assumed that had translated into some kind of cachet in South Africa, some sort of fame or celebrity or idolisation. And neither Masinga or Radibi had ever heard of him. I found that extraordinary. Yeah,
well, I think that he was known about in South Africa, certainly especially when he went, it was pretty well trumpeted in the press, because there was started at that time, actually, it was starting to become a bit of a stream of players, because you'd had Steve Mokone and Jerry Francis already, who'd had varying degrees of success, but Jerry Francis in particular at Leeds had done well, and that's when Albert came in. So he was signed at kind of great fanfare, but I think was quickly forgotten in South Africa because he faded from public life and became, you know, turned into this guy who was an alcoholic and was beaten up by the police regularly, and it's absolutely awful what happened to him.
For people who don't know about the end of Albert Johanneson's life, that is a very tough read, and I won't tread on the toes of your book, but let's go to 1965 and the hours before the FA Cup final. I'm essentially going to ask you to paraphrase your own book, which is quite weird, but that is a very difficult passage to read in terms of what it says about British society at the time. At a point in history where we kind of thought, well, looking back, people like me, who are naive seemingly, think, yes, we're quite open-minded and liberal, and in reality, a black player is waiting the Wembley Tunnel to, at what should be the apex of his career, to play an FA Cup final, to make history, and he's being barraged by racist chanting, so much so that he asked Don Revie not to play. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, well, for the Albert Johanneson chapter, I spoke in great detail to his biographer. He's called Paul Harrison, and he was a big Leeds fan who sort of grew up watching Albert, and a lot of the memories are taken from Albert's direct interviews with Paul. So and Paul always stressed to me that Albert felt that, you know, everybody remembered him for that day, 1965 FA Cup final against Liverpool, and that's how he was known, the first black player, the first African player. But actually for Albert, it sounds like it was really almost the worst day of his life, which just sounds so sad. And people, it's really difficult to get your head round that, why that would be. But, you know, when you read what the sort of the circumstances he had to deal with and the environment he had to play in, and it's no wonder, really, is it, that he was just filled with trepidation and dread about stepping out on that pitch, even though he knew he had the ability, which is the really sad thing.
I found, we're talking non-65 Cup final, there are two things that sort of really stood out. Firstly, the story about how, I think it was a cup final against Sheffield Wednesday, Leeds United travelled to Hillsborough, and there was a steward there, I forget the year, apologies, but there was a steward outside Hillsborough who didn't want to let Johanneson into the ground, and only did so because Billy Bremner threatened him. That was, I'd never heard that before, and it's something that you associate with the Jackie Robinson era Brooklyn Dodgers, which was obviously many years before, so it was quite a stark realization, and a horrible thing to read. But also, I think I never appreciated the treatment that Johanneson received on the pitch. There's a story that you tell about him being kicked to pieces during a game, and him sort of seemingly quite politely saying to the referee, "Hang on, you know, I'm being punched and kicked," and the referee being not necessarily ambivalent towards it, but just sort of, well, what do you expect? You know, you're different. I found that was extraordinary.
Yeah, and it just sums up the attitudes at the time, and I think you'll find it, especially in all the early chapters in the book. You know, Arthur Wharton had to deal with all this in the mainstream press as well. Back then, they weren't afraid to use that sort of, you know, really shocking language that today, you know, you'd be arrested for, but this was being used by national newspapers. So it's a theme, obviously, and unfortunately, as we've seen in recent times, that still hasn't gone away. And unfortunately, that is a theme of the book. You know, it goes all the way through. And I try not to put in too many references, but I think it's important to have some things like this just to show to show people what it was actually like and what normality was in those days.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously reticent to say it on a podcast. I think some of the press clippings are toe-culling. It's incredible. I mean that in the genuine sense of the word. It is the way he was referred to, and actually the way another player. Let's move on to Steve Mokone, because the same is really true of him. In terms of how he was referenced by the press and the language that was used to describe his performance by, you know, what were the sort of the columnists of the day. Firstly, okay, so give us the cliff notes on who Steve Mokone was, because it's one of my favourite chapters in the book, but it's pretty convoluted.
Yeah, it's a very long story, and believe me, to get it into one chapter was quite a challenge, because I've done a lot of work on this otherwise. So he was the first South African black player, anyway, to play in English football, and he came into Coventry in 1955, and the thing is, he only played a very small number of games. He also ended up playing for Cardiff and Barnsley, but again, very briefly. But it's more the sort of some of the myths that have sprung up around Steve Mokone. If you're not aware of them, then it's worth looking on. Worth reading the book, obviously. But if you want a quick look, just have a look at him online, and there's lots of stuff written about him. But the gist of it really is that he, after his career, moved to America and ended up in prison for two things. One was orchestrating an attack on his wife's attorney with acid, and then also attacking his ex-wife with acid. and he got sentenced to for 12 years in prison, which he served the majority, including being in Attica prison, in the same cell block as Reuben Hurricane Carter. And then he came out of prison and was sort of living a quiet life. And then just after he died, his daughter said that she was sexually abused by him and sort of basically disabused a conspiracy theory that he'd been set up by the CIA in America. So as you can see, it's quite a long story. That is the end point. But yeah, lots of interesting details in there, including which a lot of the stuff again came from his own autobiography, which really has to be read to be believed.
Right. Well, this is my next question. So with that chapter, it's probably the first time I felt like this when reading a book in a long time. It was like reading about two different people. Sorry, got a bit of doing too much podcasting. My voice is going. But it was like we went from this timid guy who the first night he stays in England, he's staying in a hotel in Piccadilly in London, and he puts out his shoes. The maid comes and takes his shoes, and she's white, and he thinks she's stolen my shoes, because he's just, that dynamic is so alien to him. And then you go through his career, and he is unfortunately subject to all the usual prejudices and the treatment, all the things that we've just described about Albert Johanneson. And then within a couple of paragraphs, it's this incredibly sinister tone, but then mixed in with, like you say, a lot of the detail from his autobiography, which makes him sound like a bit of a Walter Mitty character. There's when you talk about, him claiming to have played for Barcelona, and you contacting Barcelona to try and verify it. It's extraordinary stuff.
Yeah, and one of the other favourite stories that he used to tell was he had this nickname that he'd been given by an Italian journalist, that he was the Maserati of soccer, because he scored 5 goals in one game for Torino. And I mean, the thing is, it was sort of there were lots of half truths in there. He was on the books of Torino, but it seems that this picture that he always claimed with him scoring 5 goals was from a reserve team match. I spoke to historians at Torino, and it was quite interesting actually getting when I said his name to them, they were like, yes, and they sort of laughed about it. And it's known as, in Italy, it's known as the myth de Mokone. And he said he won the 1959 European Player of the Year, which Alfredo Stefano. Not sure what he would have said about that. And the thing is, in South Africa, this is one of the themes of the book as well. The way that people are portrayed, and they want, or either they want to portray themselves or are portrayed by other people. And in Mokone's case, he has massaged his image incredibly over the years. Before, even after his career long after his career was over, he was really proactive in trying to push these myths that he'd played for Barcelona and all this stuff. I've got lots of correspondence he's had with various journalists over the years about Barcelona and things like this, and also his
Juventus at one point or something, wasn't there? That
he was at Marseille as well, but that's true. That's true as well. But the thing is, he was on and I think that's the thing to say about it. It's rather than being too judgmental about him as well. I don't want to say that he was a bad man or anything like that, because he was absolutely a pioneer, and in another world, in a more fair world, perhaps he would have been a superstar playing for Barcelona. Maybe not Barcelona at the time, because they couldn't sign foreign players at the time. But you get my point. If it had been a level playing field, he certainly had the talent, because by all accounts, I speak to Bobby Gould, who watched him as a child when he was at Coventry, and then obviously went on to manage Coventry twice and play for them. And he was, still remembers him. He was transfixed by this guy who looked different to everybody else, but was also, an amazing player. So this is the thing. It's also a very sad story, and that he felt he had to embellish like that, I think. So
a tough question then, with all of these details in. So the nature of what he did achieve versus kind of the massaging of his own legend, and the sort of the way the way his life ended. He died in 2015. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. What's the legacy of a player like that? because it's quite. I mean, it's fairly opaque as a story, and it's not something with any great clarity. So, what's his place in the game today?
Well, in South Africa, he's very much still very, very popular. And he's held up as a pioneer, which is correct. He should be, but not. This book is going to cause a few problems in South Africa, maybe. But there's a lot of people, I believe, that know the full story and know it has been embellished. But yeah, he is rightly seen as a pioneer from South Africa. But unfortunately, his third wife last year has done a new book, which has all the myths in. So, and that was she did the rounds in South Africa last year. So, also the things to say is he's obviously passed away and he can't defend himself, and that's fair enough. But I just wanted to tell the full story of him, really, because it is so remarkable, and just obviously his daughter as well. She wanted her side of the story to be told, and we did a few press articles about it at the time. I just thought it was fair to hear the other side of the story as well.
Oh, I mean, I think your telling is really fair. It's really balanced. I mean, it's one of those chapters, and I mean this in the best possible way. It's one of those chapters that when you finish, you immediately start again, because his life is extraordinary. And there's nothing predictable about the story. Okay, so in the beginning, you can see the racism and the prejudice that he suffers. That's coming, unfortunately. But then the passage of his life is unbelievable.
I mean, well, just to say, sorry, I'm just going to tell you this, I think, because it's worth it. I actually, before I wrote this book, I wrote a whole book about Steve Mokone, and so there's a lot more to it. Let me put it that way. But I could only fit in a certain amount. I've spoken to so many people to do with the case. I've spoken to the district attorney in America, who was actually the first female district attorney in America, and she was on the case that convicted him. I spoke to his cellmate in Attica. I've spoken to psychologists and at length to various other people, but it was very hard to find a publisher in England. No one really was that interested. So there we go.
Well, I'm going to buy that book.
if anybody's interested, then
let's give that a plug. What's that book called?
It's called Kalamazoo.
Okay.
Which was his nickname.
Well, that's going to be the rest of my week, I think, because that's this guy is.
If you want me to send it to you, I've got it on my.
Hey man, no, listen, you sent me one book already this week, so I will buy the next one. It's okay.
Like I say, I would love that story to be told in full, because, as I said, unfortunately, I mean, I'm not shortchanging people in the book in Made in Africa with it, because I'm, introducing them, but there is a lot more to it. So.
Let's move on to Christopher Wray. So younger fans will remember him sporadically at Arsenal. Scored one of the sweetest hits I've ever seen at the Reebok Stadium, actually. But there's a point in his career where he's obviously George Weah's second cousin. And when Weah was at Monaco with Arsene Wenger, I mentioned to him, there's lots of talented friends and relatives back home who I played, national team football with. And Wenger said to him, okay, we'll bring them over, but bring them over one at a time, and if they're good enough, we'll have a look. It was interesting because it shows that the pipelines for African players, certainly African players for Liberia in certain countries, didn't actually exist in the way that they probably should have at that point, because all the players we've spoken about, irrespective of their personal lives and the difficulties they experienced, they were uniquely talented footballers. So why is it that it took so long for kind of a proper, not scouting, but a proper system to exist whereby European clubs, and remember this is post-Italian 90s, so Cameroon has happened, we've seen them break the glass ceiling. Why is it that even then there was this reticence around the continent, or around certain parts of the continent?
I think that certainly in Europe they were much quicker on the uptake than we were in England, and that's still the case today. And a lot today is to do with work permits as well. So that's one problem for English clubs. That you can't really get someone straight from Africa these days, because they need to be an international player, and to be an international player, you kind of have to be overseas nowadays. But back then, clubs in Belgium particularly, I'm thinking Daniel Amakachi and Divock Origi's dad came to Belgium in the early 90s, and so they did create that pathway. But and in France as well, they were very quick to, and it dates back a long way back to Just Fontaine at the 1958 World Cup was from Morocco, and so there was a pipeline and Portugal as well, obviously in the 1966 teams. I think it had 3 players born in Angola and Mozambique, obviously including Eusebio. So there was a pipeline, but for some reason, England and its Commonwealth, as it was known, was very slow. Was very slow to have that sort of pipeline. Even for, I mean, there was a bit of one for Caribbean players, wasn't there? In the 70s, it started happening, but for African players, it just, aside from the South Africans that we talked about, then it just dried up for black players from Africa anyway. In the UK, and it's a shame. And I think even now, still the English clubs are quite slow. They tend to buy African players that are the finished product rather than taking a risk on a young African player like they do in Europe.
There still seem to be some of the pejorative attitudes as well. Of course, like West Ham, 18 months ago, sacked their head of recruitment for what he said, and people can Google that. Let's not repeat that, but. It seems like a lot of this prejudice, I mean, it's amazing actually, if you think about, as a collective, if you think about the talent that's come out of Africa, just over the last 20 years, it's amazing that some of these attitudes survive. This kind of wariness, it's bizarre.
Well, I don't want to ruin the end of the book, but I have a great interview with the guy called Saya Sek, who set up the Diambars Academy with... the Patrick Vieira funded academy in Senegal. And he sort of explained that they produce so many good players. Half of the Senegal squad, the other half is from Génération Foot, which I have a lot about in the book as well. Where Sadio Mane came from. They produce pretty much, the whole of the Senegal national team, because there's a lot, they're expanding now, but they're the 2 big academies there, and they just show you how, the possibilities for Africa if they could get, say 10 of those academies in Senegal, the number of players that could be produced. But still, he tells me that the respect isn't there. So when he has a top 17-year-old, they own the players because they're a club as well. So when a European club comes in, and they never offer, what they offer Brazilian teenagers, like he said, the top Brazilian teenager goes for 50 million euros, but we get offered €500,000 for our best player, and he thinks that it's still, almost a legacy of kind of slavery, really, that Africa isn't respected, Africa isn't an equal partner in the football industry, and it's, Africa should be grateful for what it gets. But the reality is that Africa produces like as many players as almost anywhere now. So, hopefully attitudes will start to change when you just look at the top scorers last season in the Premier League, for example.
So I won't spoil the story, but for anyone sort of wants to read a little bit more about that valuation issue, the story about Peter Endlove and how his agent became his agent and the first contract then they negotiated together. That's a really good illustration of it, because it's kind of this is what we think we can get away with paying the African player versus what is the kind of the average for that talent in the rest of the country. I think that was
absolutely
that was very interesting.
That was
I
agree.
1992, 91 when that happened.
Yeah, it was 92, and he was Peter Endlove. Just a quick summary of it: he was wanted by pretty much every club in the country at the time. He'd scored. This was before he scored a hat trick against Liverpool, but he'd scored it in a win over Arsenal, who were the champions at Highbury, and 11 goals, I think, in his second season in England, which even is fantastic. Today, imagine how much a player like that would be worth. 20 years old he was. And he they were paying him, I can't remember what it was now. Was it 300 a week or something like that?
It was hundreds. Yeah. It was.
And the new contract was going to be 1,000 or something like that, which was still, chicken feed, really.
Yeah, and the club didn't really want his agent. I mean, his agent. Yeah, I'm not going to. I'll back off because I don't want to ruin that story. Let's instead. Let me end with an impossibly broad question for you, Ed. Would do you think the determining factors are for some of these players in regard of how they're remembered? I mean, because one of the unfortunate themes within the book is sort of the notion of the early pioneer who's forgotten, and then has to be rediscovered by a later generation, perhaps not in their own country, but certainly in relation to their significance to the country where they made their name. What's the key to the longevity? I mean, because it seems so elusive, and it was elusive to a lot of these guys.
Well, I think the fact it was elusive, but now that we can't ask them obviously because they're not here. But I think most of them would be very proud of the fact that they now are recognised. Of not most people don't know who they are, but the fact that Arthur Wharton has a statue at St George's Park that is there for, well, as long as that's there is a fantastic achievement by. I mean, that's one of my favourite chapters as well. It's the first chapter, the lengths that Sean Campbell and Phil Vasali went to make sure that this man was remembered is amazing.
Didn't
and
Sean
that
Campbell
was really
bankrupt himself?
Sorry?
Didn't Sean Campbell nearly bankrupt himself in pursuit of that?
He's dedicated his entire life to it, pretty much. I speak to him quite regularly still, and he's hoping that I don't want to ruin it for him. I think I mentioned it in the book, but hopefully there's going to be a Netflix series about Arthur, which would be fantastic. But that was really my inspiration as well for doing the whole book, because these guys made sure that people like Arthur Wharton and Paul Harrison, made sure like someone like Albert Johanneson was properly remembered, and I wanted to kind of bring that into focus, what they had done as well as doing it for lots of other players. I think it's really important that people remember how we got where we are now.
Ed, thank you so much for coming on. I know I kind of have to say this, but I do mean it in this instance. It was fascinating.
Thank you.
The book's called Made in Africa. It's coming out June the 1st. Is that a sort of is presumably Waterstones and Amazon and everywhere else?
Yeah, it's and I think WH Smith, and I'm not sure if anyone's listening overseas. I think we're working on English language and maybe some translations, but I'll let you know. Okay,
brilliant. Well, when the world returns to normal, we'll get you into the studio, into the whatever the new Tifo studio looks like, and we'll we'll do this properly.
But thank you so much for coming on. It's been great. I'm really glad you enjoyed it.
Hey, can I ask a question?
Sure, yeah.
I know. Sorry, can I just have?
It's about time, Joe.
I've really enjoyed listening to this though, which is I did think about asking a question early on, and then I just having too much fun listening. This is a slightly off-topic one, so I thought I'd wait until the end anyway, Ed. But what did you think about Justin Fashanu being inducted into the sort of footballing Hall of Fame this year? Because his story's a little more complicated than people tend to remember.
Well, it was really fantastic. And actually, talking of lockdown, we were hoping to have an event at the Football Museum to sort of launch this book because of Albert's in there, and also Arthur is in there. So, that's for Justin Fashanu. It's great to see him in there. He's, again, somebody who is probably forgotten for the player that he was a little bit because of everything else that people remember him for. But I was very, very pleased. And this was something that I was really interested in and maybe didn't give enough attention to in the book, which I would like to have given more perhaps, is the diaspora, the African diaspora in the UK, and people like Wilfred Zaha and the more modern generation. But Fashanu and his brother certainly belong to that and are part of the story.
Oh, fantastic. Well, listen, I will echo what Seb said. Thanks so much for coming on. And I can't wait to actually finish reading the book. I'm going to do that later this week. I think I will. I've read the first half of the first chapter, really prepared for this podcast. But no, I'm very much looking forward to continuing.
Well, hopefully this has given you a few insights as to what to expect.
It's certainly whet my appetite, Ed.
Excellent.
Yeah.
That's good to hear.
Well, it's not. It's a football book, but it's also not really a football book.
That's perfect.
Which is high praise because it's so interesting. It's also quite damning. Anyone wanting sort of to feel all warm inside as a result of reading it, probably not. But I think it's really important.
Well, hopefully, eventually, yeah. No, I mean, certainly the early chapters, no.
Yeah.
But the way that the stories ended is good, isn't it? Because
absolutely.
It's proof of that ability can eventually get you where you want to be, hopefully.
All right, Ed, we're going to let you get back to your weird lockdown life.
Yeah,
like
you too. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate that.
Thanks, mate. Thank you very, very much.